Hello radio enthusiasts, welcome to another video about early radio from the Roaring Twenties Antique Radio Museum. This is our fifth video on people who made a major impact on radio history. In this video we will be showcasing one of radio's earliest manufacturers of radio tubes, Otis B Moorhead. Otis B Moorhead was born on January 9th, 1893 in San Francisco, California. By Moorhead's late teens, he had worked as a telegraph operator on both land and ship-based radio stations. In 1914, Moorhead was employed by Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America. At the 1915 World's Fair in San Francisco, he worked nights at the DeForest booth selling tubes. That experience sparked his interest in manufacturing his own radio tubes. As a side note, Moorhead was working with Elman Myers at the DeForest booth, the same Myers who would later manufacture his own radio tubes, Myers Tubes, and the RAC or rack tube. Moorhead met Myers' sister Barbara at the exposition, and he ended up marrying her. Later in 1915, Moorhead teamed up with Elmer T. Cunningham to design a gas detector tube. The partnership did not last long, and they parted ways. This early partnership likely explains why Moorhead's and Cunningham's early tubes were so much alike. That same year, Moorhead teamed up with Ralph Hyde, former plant superintendent at the GE Mazda Lampworks factory in Oakland, California. Working together, they produced Moorhead's first radio tube, the electron relay or ER tube. The site of Moorhead's first factory was kept secret, and his tubes were sold out of a real estate office. It was clear Moorhead, at the very least, suspected he was violating DeForest patents. The early tubes produced were less than stellar performers, but Moorhead sold enough of them to get the attention of Lee DeForest. In 1916, DeForest filed a lawsuit to stop Moorhead from selling any more of his tubes, as Moorhead was violating DeForest's patents. The judge in the case put the suit on hold since DeForest's patents were being challenged by Marconi at the time. Moorhead continued to manufacture his electron relay tubes and began advertising them that same year, with an ad in the August edition of the Electrical Experimenter. Moorhead would advertise under the name Pacific Research Laboratories. There was a lot going on in Otis Moorhead's life for someone who was only 23 years old at the time. Moorhead's early electron relay tubes performed poorly, and production stopped within months. A new electron relay was introduced in 1917 to replace it. During that year, the company's name was changed to Moorhead Laboratories. On April 4th of the same year, the United States entered World War I. Somehow, Moorhead was able to obtain contracts with the U.S. and British governments to supply radio tubes, without a proper factory to mass produce them. Moorhead would quickly have to find a new building to set up his new factory. He found his company's future home at 638 to 640 Mission Street in San Francisco. The tubes would be made to government specifications, and for the first time Moorhead would manufacture tubes with the now well-known brass base and 4-pin connections. Much of the equipment to mass produce the new tubes would have to be designed and built from scratch. There were many challenges in manufacturing the new tubes. After much trial and error testing, the challenges were overcome and the company began production. Some of the types of tubes manufactured for the British and American governments during World War I were the Type R receiving tube and the Type B transmitting tube for the British government. Moorhead manufactured the SE-144 receiving tube for the U.S. Navy. The March 1920 edition of the Pacific Radio News reported that Moorhead Laboratories supplied 100,000 SE tubes to the U.S. military and 50,000 tubes to the British government during the war. Despite having government contracts, Moorhead Laboratories ran into financial problems. Otis Moorhead admitted this himself in November of 1918. He blamed his partners and took full control of the company and reorganized it. With full control of the company, he made agreements with DeForest and Marconi. Going forward, Moorhead Laboratories would be the only company licensed to manufacture receiving tubes sold to the general public. The license would not last long. In January of 1920, Marconi canceled Moorhead's license to manufacture radio tubes. Once again, the company was still in financial trouble and Moorhead stockholders voted for another reorganization. Moorhead was demoted to chief engineer and was forced to sign over his patents to the company. Otis Moorhead's skills as a businessman were very limited. As part of the reorganization, two distribution companies were established, the Atlantic Radio Supplies Company and the Pacific Radio Supplies Company. In August of 1920, Moorhead Laboratories began advertising their tubes as AP tubes. In 1922, Moorhead and some of his business associates formed the Universal Radio Improvement Company of Alameda, California. They developed the Moorhead AP solenoid detector tube. The tubes turned out to be unstable performers and not as efficient as the standard tubes of its time. Otis B Moorhead died from injuries he sustained in a fall at his home on January 1, 1923, at the age of 30. He left behind his wife Barbara and 2 children. Otis Moorhead had a keen sense of humor, but he was impulsive and short-tempered. The company he founded struggled to stay in business until 1925 when Moorhead Laboratories was taken over by QRS Music Company of Chicago. The takeover allowed QRS to expand their business into radio tube manufacturing. Otis B. Moorhead's premature death was tragic, and although his 9 years in the field of radio was comparatively brief, over a century later, his work has not been forgotten. That's it for this video. There will be more to come as we continue to investigate the early history of the world's first mass medium, radio. Thanks for watching.